Hey everybody, welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. We're on to episode 70 here, and I've got a special guest who'll be joining me in a minute, and we're going to talk really about choosing lumber for workbenches. You guys might remember many episodes ago, I brought up the idea that if you have a specific project that you want to discuss lumber selection for, that I'd welcome you on the show. And Alex is looking to build a workbench, and it's one thing woodworkers love to talk about is workbenches. So I figured it would be a good time to bring him on the show. Before I do that, I want to give the obligatory, much appreciated thanks to all the patrons who support this show. If you want to be a patron of Lumber Update, go to patreon.com/lumberupdate, and whatever, $1 a month, $1 a year, whatever you want to do, really appreciate it and helps keep the show going. So without me rambling on anymore, let's jump right into my interview with Alex. Joining me today is Alex Adams. Alex hails from Nebraska, from the Cornhusker State. So despite my University of Colorado alumni status, I will permit him to be on the show. Are you a Husker grad, Alex?
Yes, I did go to the University of Nebraska.
Okay. All right. We're going to put those things aside. But Alex is actually a hand tool school member. That's how we first got to know one another. And he is about to build a workbench. And basically the idea was wanting to procure a bunch of different species of lumber with the idea of, hey, while I'm building a workbench, I might as well get some practice with a variety of species of wood. So we thought, hey, why not come on the Lumber Update? Because listeners, you may remember, I've kind of thrown this out as an open invitation. Anybody who has a project on their bench, or maybe the bench is the project, and are curious about choosing the right lumber, we can get real technical and we can talk about the right species for that particular project. So that's what we're going to do today. So that being said, Alex, tell the folks about yourself. How did you come to woodworking? How long you been in it? And maybe tell us a little bit about your plans for your workbench.
Okay. Well, I've always liked building stuff and creating as a kid, mostly with Legos or boards and nails or whatever I could find or get my hands on. But my first kind of formal woodworking stuff was in a shop class in middle school. We made this clock that had some storage in it. So that was kind of my first exposure. But that desire to create and build led me to study mechanical engineering, like you had said earlier, at the University of Nebraska. And I learned a lot more about, design, learning about material properties, mechanical properties while I was there. And I credit a lot of my background in learning how to design and build things with the time that I spent designing surgical robots in a surgical robots lab, because in that space you had to assemble and make everything that you designed. So you learned very quickly how to make stuff easy to assemble. Grinding something down for an hour or two, you learned a tolerance a lot better. And so I began to understand that needing to know your material and the limitations of the tools that can actually form that material is very important. Just like the, stuff that's made out of aluminum versus stainless steel. Things are going to be a lot more expensive with stainless steel because it's just so much harder, and you need sharper, harder tools, and you're going to break more tools making stuff, so it's just more expensive. But then fast forward to this last year, we were clearing out a couple of trees in our backyard to kind of open up the space because it was kind of small, and I didn't want the wood to go to waste. And so what I did was watch some YouTube videos, found an electric chainsaw, an off-brand Alaskan sawmill, and started milling up some boards. And as I was going through this process of making them into boards, trying to make them into charcuterie boards for friends as well as family, I kept on hitting roadblock after roadblock, lots of rookie mistakes, not realizing that I had to actually dry wood. And then when I dried the wood, I most definitely case hardened it. And about out of the 30 board feet or so out of the crabapple tree that I had milled up, I only got about 1 foot length that was actually clear of cracks or anything, only to find out later on that crabapple wood is notorious for cracking. But yeah.
Fruit wood in general, by the way, crabapple is, I guess, it's still a fruit wood, but fruit woods in general are really prone to cracking just because they're so dense, and they have a fair amount of
I went down
extractives in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I went down the rabbit hole of YouTube videos as I've been learning stuff on the fly, and I learned stuff, but it was very time intensive kind of piecing together all this information from everywhere. And then, I was looking for better resources to, figure stuff out and not make as many mistakes. And that's kind of how I came across the Wood Talk and Lumber Update podcasts, which ultimately led me to enroll in the hand tool school, as you had mentioned earlier, because I was looking to be in that environment where I could learn from other people who had been through this already to kind of expedite the process of learning and creating. So that kind of brought me to where we are now, as you had mentioned, where now I'm looking to build that first workbench and learn kind of what woods I actually like or maybe don't like to work with in the future.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I am curious, going back a little bit, you used an Alaskan mill with an electric chainsaw?
Yes.
Interesting. The thought never. Well, what's the bar length on the electric chainsaw?
18 inches.
It's kind of crazy to think, because I have an electric chainsaw myself. I can't remember the bar length. It's not 18 inches. It's a little guy. It's really meant for pruning trees more than anything else. It's slightly bigger than one of those big pruning saws on a stick. But the thought, it never occurred to me to employ it in an Alaskan mill. It's kind of interesting because thinking going electric with an Alaskan mill, certainly it's going to have some limitations, but at the same time, that lowers the barrier to entry into milling your own lumber quite substantially. I think.
Yeah, because it was only at like $100 chainsaw, like on a Black Friday deal, and it's corded, so I don't have to worry about constantly charging batteries or filling up gas or anything. There are a couple of downsides to it. I do need to add in some auxiliary lubrication with oil into the bar because it doesn't flow very well with it. But you kind of get what you pay for. For $100 on the chainsaw mill, special ripping chain for another $30, and then I think it was like $70 for my off-brand Alaskan chainsaw mill. I had to make some modifications to it to make it work. So, for under,
I could just see that
$200, $300.
Certainly if you've got, 8-foot trunks, and things like that, that's not quite the right thing. But, I run into a lot of instances, and I hear from a lot of people who, get logs, pick up a log off the side of the road, or they've had a tree removed and it's already been bucked. So a lot of times it's 24, 36-inch long rounds. And for something like that, I can remember back when I had a bandsaw, breaking things down on a bandsaw. That was a nightmare. On a 3/4 horsepower riser block bandsaw, that didn't work real well. Mm-hmm. But I could actually see employing something like an Alaskan mill, for like cutting out Windsor chair seat blanks or something like that. When I've got I've already bucked the log to like 30 inches long, which is way longer than I would need. The length of the log translates to the width of the Windsor chair seat in that point. That could actually be a really interesting idea. I currently split them, but there's a fair amount of waste when you're trying to split out like an 8 to 10 quarter thick blank. Because when you split, you're generally ending up with wedged shape pieces, pie shapes.
Yeah.
So trying to split out a parallel-sided blank, first of all, is very difficult to do. But at the same time, you end up with some sort of a wedge shape, and there's a fair amount of waste there. So that's an instance where, in the Windsor chair seat, it doesn't need to be riven. Its strength doesn't rely upon, the continuous grain fibers. You're not bending it. You're not carving it really, really narrow or anything like that. So yeah, sorry, I'm taking us off topic, but it just kind of, I don't know why I never thought about that, but it kind of opens up the whole idea of milling your own lumber, at least on a smaller scale. I'm sure it's probably a gateway drug and it will lead you to, okay, now I'm going to start milling this 8-foot tree or whatever. But that's the other thing, is when you start talking about 8-foot long logs, they're massively heavy. So then you have to have equipment to move it, and maybe a trailer, and it can get real dangerous real fast, because now you're pushing around tons of weight. So, anyway, kind of completely took us off topic there, but it is kind of kind of exciting to think that it can be a lot more accessible that way.
Definitely.
So anyway, I interrupted your your story there. What I am curious about is, you're certainly not the first engineer to join the hand tool school. it is very interesting to understand the structure and how it works. I actually, in addition to a music degree, I actually have a physics degree. So there's a fair amount of technical, scientific brain, whether I choose to admit it or not. And what I discovered is the understanding kind of the structure of how just in general wood is put together really helped me to understand the physics of woodworking. It's a wedge, it's really it. All blades are some sort of a wedge, and you can act more like a cutting knife or more like a splitting wedge, depending upon the size of the bite, the bevel on the wedge, or et cetera. And being able to translate that to specific species and how those technical properties vary from, say, white oak to red oak or to maple, and to understand now what's going to happen when I introduce a wedge to this particular structure. What happens if I skew that wedge? What happens if I, sharply tap on the wedge or lightly tap on the wedge? And that actually really, I think, what drew me into hand tools, because I couldn't really feel that with a power tool. I was machining the wood. I wasn't really working the wood. And please don't get me wrong, power tool folks, you're still working wood before you start sending me nasty letters. But the low horsepower, the total lack of torque, and the low RPM that is hand tool woodworking really allows you to kind of feel the structure and what you're doing, how you're unzipping those fibers and things. It's really, so I'm saying all of this to say I actually think I can kind of understand where you're coming from on that side of things, especially with a strong material science background.
Yeah, and it's, like you had said, having that tactile feedback gives you a lot more information to work with to, figure out how you need to adjust and work with this organic material. That's also why I like fly fishing, is because, instead of fishing with, a lure and a bobber where you're just waiting for it to go down, with fly fishing, you get the excitement of seeing the fish hit the fly and immediately get that feedback on the line of, they're actually there. I need to react. So that I enjoy that instant tactile feedback that I, get when woodworking.
Sure. That and the casting's a lot more fun.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit more relaxing.
I was going to say that we're going to turn this into a fly fishing show real quick. Now tell me, what are your thoughts on Tenkara? No, don't tell me that. Let's talk about workbenches, because ultimately that's really what we're talking about. You talk to 10 woodworkers and you will find 12 of them want to talk about workbenches. So there doesn't seem to be any end. Even if you have a workbench, perfectly happy with your workbench, people still want to talk about workbenches. So essentially the thesis, if you will, of this episode is you're going to build a workbench. And one of your goals in building that workbench is to get exposure to a bunch of different species of wood. So tell me about the workbench. What kind of bench are you building? What are your thoughts, dreams, hopes, etc. for that bench?
Right. Yeah. So it's the workbench that is presented in the hand tool school that has the split top. It's got the 4x4s for structure, and there's really not a lot to it other than that. And then the aprons on the side. So there's not,
so
a
for
lot
listeners,
of
it's essentially a Nicholson style workbench. It's got wide aprons, 4 legs, couple mortise and tenons. And then there's a split top for no other reason than the fact that we're using kind of off-the-shelf lumber. So I built it using construction materials, 2x12s, 4x4s, and 2x12s. So I use 2x12s for the aprons, 2x12s for the top, and 4x4s for the legs and stretchers. And, there was no other reason for the split top other than the fact that we could put a planing beam down the middle. So it's a relatively simple design. It's a design that's been around for several hundred years, highly, highly functional. So your thought, Alex, is to, yours is going to be dressed up a lot more than mine, since I just use construction lumber.
Most definitely.
And what are your thoughts species-wise? Like right now, what are you thinking?
What I want to make it out of are local species of trees that I can find here in Nebraska. I've actually gone out and found a couple of sawmills where I can get locally sourced and milled material, because I want to start making more things out of locally sourced materials to kind of keep that local economy going. And in
Mm-hmm.
addition to that, I work part time at a furniture store, and they've seen a couple of things that I made, and they're interested in selling some of that in the store. And so that idea of selling something that's locally sourced, locally made, kind of factors into this as well. So getting practice with those local materials that I have access to that are also probably a little bit more affordable than stuff that would need to get, shipped in from different locations. So there's a couple of different
Sure.
angles there.
Well, and I think everybody is interested in the locally sourced idea, but I also think that lately there has definitely been a shift back towards domestics. I mean, I said this in my predictions for 2022 is domestics are going to play a larger role. But I think in general, certainly the rising cost of lumber well before COVID, rising cost of exotics due to any number of things, but then environmental concerns and things like that have driven a lot of people to look for locally sourced. And what's a little sad is when there was so much push towards these, wonderful, luxurious exotics, we kind of lost sight of just the incredible diversity of wood species that we have here in North America. And there's a lot of domestics. Like you can, again, we'll talk to 10 woodworkers, name 5 species of wood. And, the number of exotics that they name in many instances outnumbers the domestics because we have maple, oak, cherry, and walnut. And that's kind of like what most people think of. But there's this whole variety of, different types of oak and different types of maple and sycamore and catalpa and hackberry and hickories and just amazing domestic species that don't get any press. So the more you can look locally sourced, the more you might actually be able to tap into some of those cool things. So what are you finding? What is local in Nebraska?
Yeah, so the one sawmill that I'll probably be getting most of it from, they've got a pretty simple pricing structure, and kind of in their entry level stuff, they've got ash, elm, Kentucky coffee, hickory, silver maple, sycamore, locust, mulberry pine, catalpa. Then in their medium category of price, there's red and white oak, eastern red cedar, hackberry. They've got the quarter sawn sycamore in there, and then in their higher dollar amount is the walnut and the cherry. So just in seeing that, there's a huge variety just to pick from, and they even have more stuff that occasionally comes in, especially with the other sawmill that I went and saw. They had Osage orange there that I wasn't expecting to see something like that. But when people plant trees, that aren't necessarily one that's local to that area, you occasionally come across interesting tree species you wouldn't expect. Like one of the trees that I cut down in my backyard is a bald cypress. I found out after searching
Really?
for a while. Yeah, we think it's because one of the previous owners of the house was from the South, and so it kind of makes sense. Like maybe she planted it because she liked those trees and it made her think of home. Maybe so that was kind of a surprise to me because originally I thought it was some kind of cedar, but I was way off.
Are you in is your neighborhood in any kind of floodplain?
No,
like how
it
close
is
are
not.
you to?
We're
Interesting.
kind of on a hill actually. We're on the side of town that's a little bit higher.
I didn't think bald cypress would grow out in the dry, arid high desert. Maybe I'm getting my cypresses mixed up, but still, that's pretty cool. Fun species to work with too. It's from a softwood perspective. It's very interesting to look at. Kentucky coffee tree, a lot of fun. I've only ever turned that, but that's beautiful. It's got a lot of just variation from one board to the other.
How dark is it?
Kind of looks like cherry at first glance. It kind of looks like cherry. Like if you were to glance at it, quickly move on, you might think it was cherry. But I find that the early and late growth bands are much more pronounced. So you get more kind of striping and striation. I mean, it is I guess I would call it semi-ring porous. I mean, it's definitely has larger pores than cherry, so you do get some striping into it. But it's got a real kind of honey brown color to it. Less red like cherry and more honey colored, which is kind of nice. That's a species that gets very little press. Most of the time when you see it, it's in turning blanks. You see a lot of pen blanks and like peppermill type blanks made out of it. And to tell you the truth, I don't know too much about the tree. Maybe the tree itself is not very large. As we are sitting here, I'm waiting. Yep, Wood Database is pulling it up right now. Tree size. No, it's a big tree. So there goes that theory. I was going to say it's a 2 to 3 foot trunk diameter, 100-foot tall tree. So no, that's not it at all. But yeah, still interesting. Hackberry is another one you get out there a fair bit, I think. Have you run into that at any of these mills?
Yeah, so hackberry is one. They actually have a lot of spalted hackberry too, which is what I'm
Yeah, I don't think
particularly
there's really
interested
any other
in.
kind. Hackberry spalt. Hackberry is very much like holly, and that it starts to stain like almost immediately. It stains very, very easily. It's very, it's kind of known for that. So to say spalted hackberry is almost redundant because it pretty much all is. But it's really cool. It takes on kind of this creamy color and then a gray color at the same time. Totally different look, but also I think actually kind of really in vogue when you look at some of like the current styles of like weathered lumber or whitewashed type appeal. Hackberry kind of already has that look. It's like hickory that's been whitewashed or something like that. It's kind of cool. Again, that's one that I haven't worked with a whole lot. I have like 3 pieces, I think, in my entire woodworking career. Don't get a lot of that out my way. So, let's talk about this. So we're going to build a workbench. You essentially need legs, you need some stretchers, you need aprons, and you need a top. And of course, stretchers, braces that run from apron to apron just to kind of build kind of a torsion box, anti-racking type structure underneath the top. So right off the bat, functionally speaking, because the thickness of the boards we're dealing with, in my design, the legs are made out of 4x4, so they're 3.5-ish by 3.5-ish actual dimensions. Top is 2x12, so anywhere from 1.5 to 1.75 actual thickness. Same thing with the aprons. So, and with the aprons being almost 12 inches wide and being kind of turned on edge, so the wide face is facing out, that provides a massive amount of stiffness to the entire structure. So, and because everything is around 2 inches thick, a little bit less in areas and thicker in the legs, you're going to get a very, very stiff, rigid structure. My design uses 3 braces that run from apron to apron. So it's heavy, first of all, because you got a lot of thicker lumber in there. But because there's quite a bit of bracing underneath the top, you don't really need to worry too much about any of the technical properties of wood. You don't really need to pay attention to the stiffness or the bending strength, maybe the hardness. And this goes, I think, kind of across the board with workbenches. Even if you're building something like a Roubeau design where there is no wide apron, there's a span there, and in many instances you might have a 5 or 6 foot span between the legs, but the Roubeau design has like a 4-inch thick top. So the stiffness that comes out of a 4-inch thick slab, whether it's a laminated slab or solid slab or whatever, is so high that you're going to get zero deflection. So in workbenches, because the material we start with is relatively thick, if you were building a workbench out of 3/4 inch, S2S material, that might be a different story. And we might have to think a little bit more about what the stiffness and thing is. So all that to say, functionally, structurally, I think no matter what you choose, you're going to have a rigid, strong workbench. The one thing we might look at would be the hardness. And there are 2 schools of thought here. You build a workbench out of something really stout, really hard, so it doesn't, you don't bang up your workbench. Then the other school of thought is, well, you should build that out of something softer than the wood you normally work with, because you don't want your workbench denting your project, right? It's okay to dent your workbench. We're going to spill blood on our workbench. Let's be real. At least I have, and a lot of finish. And I've got holes drilled in it by accident all over the place. It's a workbench. It gets beat up. But I don't want to beat up, this nice, box I'm building or this chest of drawers I'm building. So there is that thought that, you want it to be so that it won't ding up your project. I fall in the former. I would rather the workbench be hard and durable so that I'm not like splintering it and chipping parts off. And if I'm worried about damaging my actual project, that's usually later in the project, like when I'm preparing for finish or something. And if necessary, I will put something down, between the bench and the top. Dings happen. We just learn how to fix them. I've worked on workbenches made out of northeastern white pine. I've worked out of workbenches made out of western red cedar, Atlantic cedar. So we're talking Janka hardnesses of under 400 foot-pounds. I've worked on a cherry workbench at about 800 Janka. I have an ash Rubo, which is around 1200. I have a Douglas fir workbench that hovers around 800 Janka. Douglas fir is dramatically different hardness from early wood to late wood. So I tend to think of my Douglas fir workbench being at least as hard as my ash workbench. And I've never had issues where it's damaged my project. I have had many issues where I have dinged the edge, the leading edge of the workbench, or dropped something metallic or whatever that is dented the edge of it. If that were a softer wood, it wouldn't have dented, it would have splintered, and caused more problems. The Western Red Cedar workbench that I worked on at the Stepping Stone Museum for years was just a mass of splinters. It really got beat up. Now, granted, this bench was 85 years old, but there was also a continental Hungarian. It was a Hungarian cabinet maker from 1860 something. And I worked on his European beech workbench. And it was, it was old. It was worn down in places, but it was not splintery in the slightest. It was more rounded over, like where you could see where the cabinet maker used to stand a lot and used to kind of like lean. And there was like this slight depression there. You could even kind of make out like a palm print. It was kind of crazy. But it was as sound and as sturdy as probably the day it was built. And I think that's where the softness issue of building out of something like cedar, not only is the top getting dented, but your junction between like your tenon shoulders and the leg is deforming over time. And I think that's where a lot of the racking and rocking may come from. So really, I think the guidance for a workbench is something that's going to be relatively hard. That being said, I built my orientation workbench out of construction pine, knowing full well that it might not last as long. I think it will probably last 10 years before, if I worked on it solidly for 10 years, it would probably be kind of beat up and might be a little rickety at that point. But that was the whole idea. That's why I call it the orientation workbench. Mm-hmm. It's kind of your first bench. So let's just kind of push that aside, knowing that really any species that you choose, we're talking hardwoods at this point. At least you've been talking about hardwoods. Mm-hmm. I don't think you're going to run into any issues with the technical properties not being able to stand up to the stress that you're going to put on it while building whatever it is at your workbench. So have you got any kind of ideas of, well, first of all, like how many species do you want to incorporate into this bench? What's your thoughts there?
I was kind of thinking maybe 4 or 5 if we're, feeling adventurous.
Okay.
Because the idea that I had for the top was that I like to film what I'm working on, just kind of some, not any high quality stuff, but just kind of, just to kind of document what I'm doing. And so I'd like to have one that's one side of it, since it's split top, be dark, and then the other side to be light. So depending on what I'm working on, there's some contrast there, so it's easy to pick up on in the video.
Okay.
So when it comes to like something that's darker, when it comes to any of these local wood species that I can easily get my hands on walnut. So I think I'm pretty set on having walnut on one side, but it's the other side that is the lighter side of that bench where I'm still trying to figure out what I might go with for that side. And then
I actually wonder if walnut's a good idea. It might be too dark.
Really?
I think you might be better off. Well, let's back up and say the other side should be light. First and foremost, setting up a hand plane to work, a lot of times you will turn it upside down and sight from the toe down along the blade, and you'll adjust the lateral adjuster in order to get the blade straight in there. If you try to do that against a dark background, you're going to go nuts. You need a nice white light background in order to be able to see the blade well, because what happens is that steel sole, I suppose if it were a wooden plane, it would be a slightly different story, but the sole of the plane is already somewhat dark, and the reflection and everything kind of makes it look darker as you're sighting along it. So having a light background really allows you to see the iron. So I would suggest the side that, benches, if you put it in the middle of the room, you can work all the way around it, but the side that you would normally work on should be a lighter wood. Behind that, I think you want more of like a darker, like an oaky brown rather than a walnut brown. Rather than going all the way to chocolate brown, go to like khaki or tan, just because you tend to lose stuff on a really dark bench. It also sucks up the light. And it can be really hard. It can be really hard to discern the difference. Plus, I think the contrast, well, first of all, from a filming perspective, the contrast from just say like a maple front to a walnut back is going to be so hard that the camera may struggle a bit. I also think that really, really dark brown, I went through a walnut period for a while where just about everything I built was in walnut. Still my favorite species of wood, but it became really hard after a while to kind of see details and see what was going on, because everything was just so dark and it just sucks up the light. So I feel like you might go too dark to go walnut. And you might look more along the lines of, well, you could go red-ish, that may be where the coffee tree could come in, or, you could even use the gray side of hackberry to do that. The only problem there is you might end up with a pretty variegated color. Getting a consistent gray hackberry might be a little difficult. I would choose what you're going to do for the front first, and then look for more of a complement rather than a contrast.
Yeah, it probably doesn't help that I'm in a dingy basement too. I need more lights.
Yeah, you will be surprised how much it will like turn into an event horizon, and you'll lose stuff. It sounds silly, but it's really surprising how much light is reflected off the workbench, especially if it's in the middle of the room. I just think that might be a bit too dark. I know Mark Spagnuolo, when he was trying to do the same thing with contrast and he put the stain on his workbench, he complained of the same thing. It was just so dark that it was actually difficult to see things. So oak, like the brown side of oak, like a white oak, would be an interesting contrast, or complement, I should say. You could go even darker than that, I think. Well, what are some of the? Can you just list off some of the local stuff that you're seeing?
Stuff that they usually have a lot of. They've got a lot of ash, a lot of hickory. That I can't remember if it's silver or red maple. It's definitely the soft maple. A lot of oak. We had already mentioned the walnut already. I know those ones, and we're probably not going to use the eastern red cedar, but they've got a lot of that around in the area.
That's too soft.
Yeah,
too soft. Also, really, really oily, which I don't know, shouldn't be too much of an issue, but I don't know. I feel like I would get a headache working around like aromatic cedar, which is really what we're talking about. Like all the time, you're like being shoved in a cedar chest for your entire life in the workshop. That might be a bit of a problem.
But I wouldn't have to worry about bugs then.
No, that's true.
That'd be one upside.
Very true.
Too many downsides though.
Do you know what kind of hickories you're getting? Is there anything more specific than hickory, or
from what I understood, I know that the guy that I talked to at the sawmill, I know that they have pecan. And I think the other variety they have, I think it's bitternut, I think is the variety of hickory.
Because that actually might be a good option. It's a darker brown. you're getting ash. In fact, I think you actually have some ash logs now, don't you?
Yes, I picked up some ash logs this weekend, and I'm planning on riving them soon. So
Okay.
I might have, depending on how that goes, I might have ash. We'll see how good my riving skills actually are. But I think
Right.
I might be able to get some 4x4s out of that, because some of them are, I think, about 24 inches in diameter. So I might be able to
Mm-hmm.
get some legs out of that in ash.
I think choosing something like soft maple for the front part of your workbench, the front half of your workbench, and something like a pecan or any of the whatever hickories they have, but
Hmm.
bitter nut certainly is going to be a little bit browner than some of the other varieties I get out my way. That I think would be certainly you're going to have two species there that are hard. Soft maple being around 850 Janka, and then the pecan I want to say is 12 or 1300. It's up there. So both of those would end up being quite strong. You could also use hard maple if you want, 1400 Janka hardness on the front, or ash at around 1200. But I also think, having worked on that European beech workbench for so long, the really tight, close, tiny pore structure of something like maple or beech was really nice. I work on an ash bench now, and ash has a structure very much like red oak, big, wide open, ring porous wood, and it's fine, but it's certainly those open grain channels sometimes really hang on to the dust, and sometimes can just I just put it this way. Sometimes I wish I had a slightly smoother bench top. It's not that my bench is like ridiculously not smooth, but having that really smooth surface caused by a diffuse porous wood could be kind of nice. So something like, soft maple or hard maple up front would probably be, I think, a little better than going with ash on the top anyway.
Hmm.
The legs, we're talking about larger, 4x4 size legs. I mean, heck, the bench, that's the nice thing about that bench is you can make it whatever size you want. If you rive out a piece and it's going to be more of a 5x5, hey, that's just more mass. It's going to make the bench more stable. So if you've got, bucked log rounds that are, of around that length, it should be relatively successful in riving out a piece that could give you, a good sized leg. What's the diameter of these ash logs that you have?
They kind of vary from about 18 to 24 inches, most of them. I did actually
Okay.
pick up. They had a couple of silver maple logs that I picked up, but I don't. Those ones aren't very long, so I don't know if I'll be able to get any use out of those immediately. Those
Right.
ones I think I'll have to mill, and my milling setup it takes a while to get it to cut through something.
Well, ultimately the legs are going to be, at most 36 inches, and that's pretty long. That would be a really high workbench. But as you're rounding up, you need about a 3 foot log segment, and that also happens to be something that is relatively easy to rive. Get a couple of wedges to start it, split it in half. Now you're talking, what'd you say, 18 inches diameter around there.
Yeah, on the smaller
So,
side.
factor out the cambium layers and things like that, and you split it in half, and you're going to have about an 8-inch section. You can then rive that half into quarters, and you're going to be pretty close to legs at that point. Grab an axe or a draw knife or whatever to strip the bark off.
Hmm.
Get in past the cambium layer. You're going to have a wedge shape that is probably around 6 inches, on two sides. Worst comes to worst, you split it in half. You split the log segment in half, and you ought to be able to at least get, I would think, 4 legs out of that log if you're talking about 18-inch diameter. Especially if you do go all the way down to a 4x4. I say if you can get a bigger block than that, don't waste the effort. No reason to remove more wood than is necessary.
Hmm.
But right away, I think first of all, free wood. You have the logs already.
Yep.
The exercise of splitting them and riving them, and just turning that wedge shape into a square cant would actually be quite fascinating. Certainly we'll learn a lot about how the wood works. The fact that they're green doesn't bother me in the slightest. The wood of most workbenches, most workbench design is perfectly fine with something that's going to be a little bit wetter. The only thing that you maybe want a little drier is the top. And if you're going to be sourcing the top from a sawmill selling kiln dried material, that won't really matter. So if you assume you can get 4 legs out of your ash logs, that's 3 species. Maybe you choose to make a different leg, a Franken leg or something. So what that leaves you with is your aprons, which could be kind of a showpiece. What you're talking about there is a wider board, or if not a board, you're going to glue up a couple of pieces to make that 12-inch wide apron. So that could be license for some creativity. If you wanted to, I don't know, get crazy and do a book match or do 2 different species, but that's kind of entirely up to you. Or what's your thought here of adding 5 species? Is it just to get exposure to 5 species, or was there any particular reason for having a different species on the apron or whatever? Is it what's in your head there?
Mostly to get more exposure to different woods. Because like you had said before, functionally, just about anything that I pick is going to do just fine. So why not try something new and figure out if I like it? And if I don't, then I've only used one piece of wood, and I don't need to come back to that later on to another project.
No, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the things when I started turning, because turning blanks are, small and therefore somewhat affordable. I was able to get exposure to some crazy woods that there's no way I could ever afford them in board form, but I could buy a pen blank or a peppermill blank and get exposure to something like Bocote. And I learned a lot about a variety of species and the different genre and how they related to one another. There's a lot to be said about that. So aprons, they're going to play a major role structurally, but again, because they're 12 inches wide, the force that's acting upon them is going to be down, certainly, but then also kind of diagonally and along the length to control racking between the legs. Functionally, though, you're going to drill dog holes in the front, and there's a lot of work holding with holdfast that happens on those front aprons. So again, choosing something that would be too soft might cause deformation over time. That would be a bit of an issue. A harder wood is just going to wear better right up front there, where you're drilling all those dog holes and using holdfasts or any number of things that could get, for lack of a better term, bolted onto the front. Say you eventually add a face vise. Having a kind of a more durable species in that apron would certainly be of benefit there. Hickory's going to be fantastic. Pecan's going to be fantastic. Any of the maples, especially if you had, if you chose hackberry on the front apron and then blended into the maple front half top, you could actually orient the cream. Well, it depends on the hackberry you get, but most of the hackberry boards I see, they tend to have kind of that creamy color and then a stripe of gray that runs through them. Some of the spalting may be a little bit more kind of camo pattern looking, but a lot of times I find that it's not actually spalting, but staining. If you listeners go back to the episode I did on fungus and mineral staining, it's more of a stain than a spalt. Spalting to me, a lot of times is very hard lines. Camo pattern comes to mind because it's a kind of an organic looking pattern, whereas staining tends to actually gradually change color from light to dark. It's not such a hard and fast line in the wood like that. So I think you could actually be kind of a cool gradient effect to use hackberry on a front apron like that. I think I would stay away from the cedars, again, just because of hardness, because the bench is a balanced design. So if you're going to use different species on the front apron than the back apron, you want them to at least be, durable, so that one's not going to start racking while the other one stays steady. If you follow me there.
Yeah.
I'm probably overstating that a fair bit, but talking to an engineer here, so I have to cover all my bases to make sure of that.
Make sure I don't pounce on you.
Let's see. Are there other species I'm forgetting here? I mean, certainly walnut. I mean, that to me is one of my favorite woods to work by hand. So if you haven't had exposure to walnut, I think if nothing else, you could get it and use it for stretcher material. Get exposure to sawing tendons and that. You could also use it as an apron. It's certainly going to be hard enough to be able to deal with that. And I don't think the dark color is going to make a difference on the apron. I don't know. What are you thinking so far? We're putting together this hackberry, maple, hickory, ash workbench, FrankenBench. Sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah, so far I'm liking doing the silver maple on the front tabletop and then hickory on the back tabletop. I'm still trying to figure out on the aprons what I'd want on that one. What do you think about ash for the aprons?
Sure. I mean, here again, it will stand up to the beating that it takes, using holdfast and things. But the apron, again, is, it's a highly visible part. So you want it, from, again, we're talking woodworkers' workbenches, so we want them to be pretty. Let's just get past that. People say, oh, it's just a workbench. Who cares what it looks like? Every woodworker I ever know cares what it looks like. So let's just if people can complain all they want, we're going to bling this workbench out. Durability-wise, no problems there. It is a pretty, no, I don't want to say easy wood to work. I mean, it is a hard wood, but it's predictable. Its structure won't throw you for a loop or anything like that. So in this instance, there's not a whole lot of work to be done to it. There's a little bit of shaping on the aprons, cutting off the corners and planing down those corners, certainly jointing the top edges and getting them coplanar with one another. So there's some hand planing that needs to be done. Boring through it, that will teach you how to sharpen an auger bit. I can tell you that much. Having bored the dog holes on my ash bench for many years now, every time I bore a new one, I end up having to sharpen an auger bit by the time I'm done. I think that in and of itself, as a learning experience, is a good excuse to use it, to tell you the truth. What other parts do we have? We've got you're going to end up cutting a couple of bridle joints, 4 bridle joints, 4 mortise and tenon joints for the stretchers, and then a whole bunch of half lap joinery for the braces. You'll have 9 different half laps to cut for the braces. All of those will essentially be unseen. So, I mean, heck, you could throw all manner of species there. And you don't need very much. So this could be a possibility for, if you don't want to spend the money, you could do some of the logs that you have just picked up, because they don't have to be very long. The braces don't have to be very long. It's like 24 inches, I think, from front to back. Round up to maybe 30. The stretchers themselves are quite short, plus tenons on each end. So 1-inch tenon on each end. So you need 16-inch long board for your stretchers between the legs and for your bridle joint pieces up top. So round up, go to 20. So those short pieces, that could be a golden opportunity. If any of these mills have like an offcut section or a bucka board section, a lot of them tend to have these large bends with just random stuff stuck in it, offcuts and things. And if they don't have it immediately available, you might ask. Total of 4 stretchers and 3 braces. You could each one of those could be a different species if you want some experience, because what we're talking about is cutting tenons on the stretchers and cutting half laps on the braces. So there's sawing and chiseling joinery needing to happen there. That could even be an opportunity if you wanted to try out a cedar. What we're talking about structurally, the braces are truly stretching, holding the aprons apart, stretching them apart. So the technical property we're talking about there is compression strength, which is the force along the grain, along the long axis of the board. It's the strongest property of wood. Even in something like cedar, it's going to be so ridiculously more than anything you would ever need. So that can actually be a great place. And if they already have 4x4s, then the only milling you have to do is cross-cut it. You cross-cut it to length and then saw out that half lap, and that actually would be kind of nice. It's a good use for it there.
Yeah.
What kind of pine do you run into at your
Oh, I know I looked it up earlier. Let me see if I can find if I wrote it down. I think it's the
lodgepole.
I think it's ponderosa pine.
Ponderosa, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, because they said that they have 5x5s in that, so that'd be a little bit more beefy of a leg.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, the legs, I'm just kind of automatically going to the ash because I know you already have some. And I personally just think splitting it out would be kind of fun to create those. But,
Yeah, I think
well,
if I get those ash pieces, I think I'll make the legs out of ash, and then maybe those cross beams, I'll try something different,
right.
like the cedar maybe.
Yeah. But I mean, the legs are another instance where really any species would work because here again, we're talking compression strength at that point, straight down on those legs. And then any dog holes you may drill in those legs, they're really not going to get that much stress, and they're backed up by structure, the tenons, the stretchers that move between them, and each one of those legs has a bridle joint at the top and a tenon 6 inches up from the bottom, so they're like ridiculously rigid once they're joined together in this kind of closed box shape. So there's a lot of species that would work there. So I think actually those stretchers and those braces is a golden opportunity to really play and experiment with different species. Even if, depending on how much work you want to give to yourself, I mean, even if you can only find thinner, say 4/4 boards, you could get some practice face laminating boards together to make a thicker piece. There's all kinds of interesting stuff that will puzzle future museum curators when they take the top off and they see you've like glued together 3 species to make a brace. I'm like, what in the world was this guy thinking? What was he smoking?
Yeah, it came across my mind because I didn't know before I had asked if they would have very many 4x4s. How would you glue up a board that would be cut into a tenon? Would you ever do that, or would that be a bizarre idea?
Oh, so you mean forming the tenon by laminating different boards together? So like the board.
No, so laminating two boards to get a 4x4, and then cutting a tenon out of that end.
Oh, that's fine. Think of it once the board is glued together, think of it as one board. Assuming your glue joint is good. If you've got a good glue joint that can be closed up with minimal clamping pressure, I like to say with hand pressure, you're going to get a fantastic glue bond. And I think tests have shown us left and right that modern glues are stronger than the wood itself. Actually, there's some testing that shows that hide glue is stronger than the wood itself. I mean, hide glue is what we use to etch glass. So, I mean, if it can chip glass, it's strong. Actually, I shouldn't say that. There's some pretty weak glass out there. But yeah, I always think of it as once you have glued that together, treat it as a single board now. Yeah, like the best way to fix a loose tenon is to glue the tenon cheek on that you just cut off. Like if you overcut the tenon and suddenly it's too skinny and it's loose in the joint, that tenon cheek that you just threw in the trash, dig it out of the trash and glue it back in place, and you can recut the tenon again. So yeah, glue and panel joints and face joints, it's kind of like the do-over button. There is a technique where, say, you have 3 boards that you're gluing together to create a thicker piece, and you leave the center board, so the creamy filling of the Oreo, leave that long, and specifically laminate the 2 flanking boards so that you actually form a tenon. Christopher Schwartz talks about this in his original Workbench book, and in my opinion, that's way more trouble than it's worth. It's because the boards can obviously slide around once you have glue on them, so they end up using like nails to register them to keep them from sliding, and it's so much easier to just glue up one thing, mill it as a square board, and then saw out the tenon, in my opinion. So if that's what you were suggesting, I would urge you not to. It's just not.
What if I did walnut on the outside on that and then maple in the middle? It would look like an actual Oreo.
It would, yeah. And you could just call it your Oreo workbench. The other part that we haven't actually talked about in this design is the planing beam. So it's a split top, and there is a center beam that actually fills in the gap between the split. And there's a series of notches on it that you can set it up at different heights to use it as a planing beam to work directly across the grain on a board. It also can actually double as a tool well. You can remove it and use that gap as a tool well, or you can actually cut notches into the board. That is another opportunity to have like a racing stripe down the middle of your bench. If you've got a walnut and maple top, or you've got a maple and pecan top, you could use walnut as your planing beam strip and have that dark brown strip right down the middle. There's a whole other species there. Species
I had not
option.
thought about that.
And certainly that is a board that could actually get a fair amount of abuse, because you're butting boards up against it and planing into that. And, no matter how low you set your planing beam, you're always going to run into an instance where you end up planing into the board. And if you chose a particularly soft wood there, it's going to splinter up on you. You want something that's, you want a good hardwood there in that instance. So there's a whole other piece that I wouldn't necessarily worry about too much right now as you're getting started, because that gap, you don't really know what the dimension of that gap is going to be until you've actually got the bench built. You can guess and you can do math and say it's going to be 1.5 inches. And I can almost guarantee you that it won't be by the time you get to that point. So you're better off, grabbing the actual dimensions on that gap once you've actually put your top in place, and then going from there. Because you might actually find that, I need a much thicker piece here, and that could actually determine what you choose based on what's available at your local yard.
And I was going to ask, on that planing bench, do you think it's more important to have hardness or shear strength on that particular piece? Because those are the two modes of failure that I think of. Because, when you're pushing up against it, you obviously want to have a hard face, but you're also essentially shearing that board. Do you think one over the other needs to be stronger, or I'm going to be fine in any scenario?
Well, what makes you say you're shearing it? Because the shearing strength of wood is you think of it as planing. As you plane the board, shearing is pulling up that shaving as you work along the grain. So shearing strength, as listed by Wood Products Laboratory, is referring to that force, how resistant it would be to pull up a shaving, in other words. So the planing beam, I don't really see. I mean, you might be planing across it from time to time, but that's the weakest direction of the grain. So what's your understanding as an engineer who knows what they're talking about of shearing?
I look at it kind of the extreme. So if you put a planing beam on there that's maybe only like, a 1/4 inch thick on one extreme, and you're pushing it through, it would just snap as you push the board through it. But on the other extreme, it's, really, really thick. It's, you're going to be denting the surface instead of just pushing through and just popping through that board.
Got it. So what you're talking about is really modulus of elasticity, how stiff it is, how much deflection will you see. If you've got the planing beam is up, and say it's up an inch above the top of the bench, and you've got a board that you're planing, say across the grain. So you've got it butted up against that planing beam as your fence behind it, which is great because it fully supports the length of that board that you're planing. As you push the plane across the grain of your workpiece, you're causing deflection on the planing beam. So the first thing is you size the planing beam to perfectly fit the gap so that the board itself can't deflect. The board itself is being held in place by the back half of your workbench top. Certainly there will be some deflection where the board is above the workbench, but in most instances, I don't think it's ever going to be above the workbench by more than about 1.5 inches. And then your gap is going to be, at least the design of the workbench is that there should be at least a 1.5 inch gap. Now, you're not using construction lumber, so you're not working with pre-dimensioned sizes, so you could end up with something thinner than that. I wouldn't, because you do want some thickness there. To use your example, if you had a 1/4 inch board, then yeah, there's a good chance of that possibly snapping as you put pressure against it. I would think you would want that gap to be no narrower than 1 inch, and I would really lean towards 1.5 more than anything else. If you can get a full 2 inch
and most
gap.
of their stuff from this lumber yard is 9/4, so it's probably going to err on the side of a little bit bigger, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can always plane it down too, to a thinner bit. But so that particular piece, I would say at minimum it should be 1.5 inches. At that dimension, you're not going to have any issues with deflection. or snapping off, if there's part of it raised above the top, you're not going to have any issues there, even if it were a soft wood. Because that's the other thing is that planing fence, that planing beam really won't get a narrow piece pushed against it. I mean, I suppose there's possibility you could actually turn a board so that the end grain is butting into the planing beam if it's a short board and you're planing there. But I can't imagine you would be getting, put it this way, the Janka test is going to be a much smaller surface area. As a 1/2 inch, diameter ball is pressed into the wood, I don't think you would be running into situations where you would be pressing something really narrow into that board that could cause a depression. You're planing, if you're traversing a board with a hand plane and that's a 12-inch long board or an 18-inch long board, you've got 18 inches of wood pressing into that beam. You can imagine the force required to cause a dent along 18 inches. I don't think it would matter what species you would put up against it at that point. It's going to be durable enough to take it. So, any other questions about shopping for this bench? I think we're getting a FrankenBench coming into focus here. What else can I help you with?
Well, the other thing that I was looking at adding to it was practicing some inlays on the tops as well as the aprons.
Okay.
So I was planning on doing, maybe on the tops, a small, maybe 3x4 inch, state of Nebraska. And then maybe on the aprons, a Nebraska N. Mm-hmm. I know that hurts you inside, but
I'll get over it.
I'll probably be.
Well,
as long as I don't fill it with epoxy, right?
Yeah. Well, speaking of not durable,
that's auto banishment from the hand tool school, right?
It's just not durable. But the beauty of inlays is now truly the sky's the limit. So, if you want to stick with a locally sourced type thing, that again would be, I would seek out any kind of offcuts or smaller piece type woods that, you really either couldn't find in a larger piece or couldn't afford in a larger piece. But it also can be an opportunity to seek out someplace like Bell Forest Products, and do a mail order, because what you're talking about is a small piece that's very easy to put in the mail, for an inlay or something like that. So that could be, I actually would encourage you to go beyond locally sourced at that point and really give yourself a chance to play with something totally different. A jungle wood could be pretty interesting there. Inlays, if you're putting into the top of the workbench, you want it to be durable. You don't want it to be super, super soft. If you're doing it on the apron, I don't think it really matters. But here again, I think the smaller you get, the more, the smaller the inlay is, kind of the harder and more structurally sound you want that to be. So imagine cutting a butterfly spline. And that butterfly spline is maybe 3 inches long. At the narrow part, in the center of the butterfly, it could only be a 1/2 inch wide, a 1/4 inch wide. So you want a pretty hard, pretty durable wood at that point, because the smaller you get and the thinner you get, obviously the easier it's going to be to crack and snap or things like that. And inlay, you're not going to want to inlay a 1.5 inch thick piece in there. You're probably going to be inlaying a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 inch thick piece into the top. If it's a workbench, you might want to go a little bit thicker because you may be flattening it over the years. But even then, I couldn't see inlaying something thicker than a 1/2 inch. That's just excess work, because you've got to, recess. You've got to cut a recess that's a 1/2 inch deep at the same time. So I think that's an opportunity to head to your local woodcraft or rock.
We don't have any of those nearby.
I don't,
unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't think they went out that far. You'd have to go to Denver, I think. That's probably your closest one. But yeah, that's a great opportunity to hit eBay. Go to any of the online retailers. There's an online retailer up in Oregon called Cookwoods that I've used a fair bit, and they have all kinds of crazy stuff, both domestic and exotic. And that's kind of like what I was saying when I started wood turning. It was an opportunity to play with stuff that there's no way I would ever be able to afford it in board form, let alone source it in board form. It just came in smaller pieces. And if nothing else, you buy yourself a turning blank or something like that, and you can use it for all kinds of projects in the future as well. So yeah, go crazy at that point. I would actually encourage you to go beyond your local sawmill because you can, because it's a lot cheaper to mail order something that's a
So
small.
what do you think would get a nice bright red color that would still be hard?
Bloodwood, Maceranduba, also known as bulletwood, Paduke. Paduke's going to tend towards oranger. If you want Nebraska red, Bloodwood. Bubinga will get you there. Aromatic cedar, but that's a little too pink and very soft. Locally, domestically, there's nothing really bright red. To get bright red, you got to go abroad, I think. South America. And really, to me, Bloodwood is the ultimate in deep red. Nice fire engine red. Bubinga also can have some purplish tinge to it as well. And a little bit more graining than something like Bloodwood. Maceranduba, it's really easy to find in decking. So you can't find it in like rough sawn lumber as much, but that really wouldn't be a detractor. Although the problem with finding it in decking is then you have to buy a whole decking board. And that stuff is really hard. Like I wouldn't recommend using it for anything other than a small inlay because it's really a pain in the butt. Something a little bit more grain to it, be something like Grenadillo. That has some nice red, but also some kind of purpley colors into it. So I still would go probably Bloodwood, although Paduke will be easier to find there is a species called Red Heart. Some people mix up Bloodwood and Red Heart, like just because of the whatever the marketing name on it. But either one of those species are going to be pretty red, pretty consistently red too, without a whole lot of kind of striping or any additional graining in them.
Okay, that's a lot of good options.
Oh yeah, it's the world of wood. It's fantastic. So many different things you can go for. So what do you think? You think we got a workbench you can build now?
Yeah, I think it's doable.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is an interesting one because the fact that we're freed up structurally, we don't have to really worry about some of the bending strengths and stuff like that. It really just allows you to play around. And I kind of like the idea of using your workbench to experiment with a bunch of different species. And especially if they're going to be species that you're going to be able to find regularly. I mean, there's something to be said about building this real showpiece out of crazy species that one time, but then who could ever afford to build actual furniture out of it later on, or you may never be able to get it again. So I really like this idea of certainly locally sourced is warm and fuzzy and feel good, but this is going to give you a lot of experience that you can kind of carry forward into that table or chest of drawers that you may build next year or 10 years from now. So it's a neat idea. I applaud you for giving this a shot.
Cool. Well, it'll be a fun experience.
Folks, this is particularly interesting. So I'm gonna kind of throw this invitation out again. Certainly there's a lot of discussion that goes on with projects that can be very personal, can be very dependent upon your own design sense or your own skill level or really what's available. But I think anybody who is listening to this that has a project in mind, I would love to have you on the show. It's kind of fun. If nothing else, it's an opportunity for two woodworkers to just talk wood. So, Alex, I do want to say thank you for coming on. Also, thank you for just doing your homework. Certainly, this would have been a very different conversation if you said, well, I haven't been to any of my yards and I don't know what they have. So I do appreciate you taking the time to do some research and figure out what you can get. And again, I applaud you for going down the locally sourced train. I think that will definitely serve you well, serve your kind of woodworking knowledge bank well over the years. So good luck with the whole thing.
Thank you.
Now I can say, now you need to go buy some hardwood.
I do.
Enjoy it. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.